Welcome to our Stations of the Cross reflections. This video has longer reflections to go deeper in story and reflection on each of the stations. If you are looking for shorter or simpler reflections for yourself or for discussion with children, there's a link to another video in the description below. We begin with an introduction to the Stations of the Cross. There is an old legend that says, after the death and resurrection of Jesus, his mother Mary would often walk the way her son had walked on his journey to the cross, pausing here and there to recall something that had happened on that spot. From these walks grew the early Christian practice of walking the Via Dolorosa, the way of the cross, in Jerusalem, a tradition that continues to this day. When they returned home, those early pilgrims to Jerusalem talked about their experiences, and soon many people began erecting stations of the cross on the walls and grounds of their own churches, so worshipers could make the journey whenever they wished. The number of stations ranged from as few as 7 to as many as 30. Over time, however, the number became fixed at 14, including 5 stations depicting events that are not found in Scripture: the 3 falls of Jesus, the meeting with Mary, and the legend of Veronica's veil. Catholic and Orthodox Christians were the first ones to use the stations in their devotional life. In recent years, however, Christians of many traditions have been rediscovering this ancient devotional practice. The story of Jesus' final hours, traditionally called the Passion, is the central story in each of the 4 Gospels. It is a story we are all familiar with, and yet each Gospel writer tells it from a different perspective. These illustrations are based on the 14 scriptural stations of the cross, which Pope John Paul II introduced on Good Friday in 1991, along with a 15th station which celebrates the resurrection of Jesus. We hope that this devotional will be a powerful resource for you as you follow the footsteps of Christ, while immersing yourself in the biblical account of the last days and hours of Jesus' life. Station 1, Sorrow. A reading from Matthew chapter 26, verses 36 to 41. Then Jesus went with them to a place called Gethsemane, and he said to his disciples, "Sit here while I go over there and pray." He took with him Peter and the 2 sons of Zebedee, and began to be grieved and agitated. Then he said to them, "I am deeply grieved, even to death. Remain here and stay awake with me." And going a little farther, he threw himself on the ground and prayed, "My Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. Yet not what I want, but what you want." Then he came to the disciples and found them sleeping. And he said to Peter, "So could you not stay awake with me 1 hour? Stay awake and pray that you may not come into the time of trial. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak." Many Americans can remember exactly where they were on the morning of September 11th, 2001. Huddled around television sets and radios, they watched and listened to the news of terrorist planes flying into the World Trade Center's Twin Towers. And then, as the impact of just how many lives had been lost began to register, a great sorrow gripped the nation and the world. During a national day of prayer, just 3 days later, Billy Graham addressed the sorrow of the nation with these profound words. The lesson of this event is not only about the mystery of iniquity and evil, but it's also a lesson about our need for one another. A tragedy like this could have torn our country apart, but instead it has united us. At this first station, in the Garden of Gethsemane, we encounter Jesus in his moment of deepest sorrow and pain. But notice, he is not alone. The scriptures say Jesus went with the disciples. He then took his most trusted friends, Peter, James, and John, with him as he began the painful journey that would ultimately lead to new life. Although we tend to give them a bad rap for falling asleep 3 times, it's worth noting that at least they were present with Jesus in these moments in the garden. While most of us will not make history-altering decisions in our lifetimes, we all have moments of deep sorrow when we need to be surrounded by the love of our friends, especially those in the community of faith. Take a look at the picture for this station. How many tears do you see? As you begin this journey to the cross with Jesus, remember you are not alone. Remember also, at night we may cry, but when morning comes we will celebrate, as shared in Psalm chapter 30, verse 5. As we come to the discussion part of our first station, I want to invite you to pause the video as you're listening to take time to discuss these questions, or to journal or talk with each other, however you want to engage. So here are a few discussion questions. Was there a time when you cried because you were very sad about something? Who can you ask for comfort when you feel sad? And going deeper, when have you faced a crisis and needed to turn to others for support or prayer? How did it make you feel to have to rely on them? Station 2, Betrayal. A reading from Mark chapter 14, verses 43 to 46. Immediately, while Jesus was still speaking, Judas, one of the 12, arrived, and with him there was a crowd with swords and clubs from the chief priests, the scribes, and the elders. Now the betrayer had given them a sign, saying, "The one I will kiss is the man. Arrest him and lead him away under guard." So when Jesus came, he went up to Jesus at once and said, "Rabbi," and kissed him. Then they laid hands on Jesus and arrested him. Et tu, Brute? Even if you're not a Shakespeare fan, chances are you're familiar with this line from Julius Caesar. About a century before the betrayal of Jesus in Jerusalem, another betrayal occurred in the city of Rome. On the Ides of March, Julius Caesar made his way to the floor of the Senate, where, to his great surprise, he found himself surrounded by assassins. An even greater surprise came when he realized one of them was his good friend and protege, Marcus Brutus. In crafting the dramatic scene in his play, Shakespeare puts into Julius Caesar's mouth these legendary words, "Et tu, Brute? You too, Brutus?" Someone once said that the saddest thing about betrayal is that it never comes from your enemies. And so it was with Jesus and Judas. The scriptures are quick to point out that Judas was one of the 12. It could even be argued that he was one of the more influential members of the inner circle. After all, he was the treasurer who made sure there was enough money to carry on the mission of building the kingdom. And yet, it was this one of the 12 who betrayed Jesus, setting in motion events that would ultimately lead to Jesus' crucifixion. We will never know why Judas betrayed Jesus. Some people believe it was because he had no choice. It was all part of God's preordained plan. Others think it was because, like Brutus, Judas was hungry for power and control of the group. Whatever his motives, his betrayal ultimately cost Jesus his life. Take a look at the picture at this station. Close to the betrayer's lips is an object that looks oddly like a crescent moon. In John's account of the Last Supper, after Judas gets up from the table to betray Jesus to the chief priests, John writes, "And it was night." Betrayal, especially by those who are closest to us, always feels as if a great darkness has descended. But take another look. Is this crescent a waxing one or a waning one? Is the picture getting darker or lighter? We alone have the power to choose what we do with a friend's betrayal. Again, as we come to the discussion questions, feel free to pause the video for the time you need to reflect or talk about these questions. Have you ever told a lie about someone you cared for? How do you think it made them feel to know you had betrayed them? And going deeper, when have you used your own position of trust to betray someone close to you? Have you ever been let down by a close friend or family member? How did you choose to deal with your feelings? Station 3, Condemnation. A reading from Luke chapter 22, verses 66 to 71. When day came, the assembly of the elders of the people, both chief priests and scribes, gathered together, and they brought him to their council. They said, "If you are the Messiah, tell us." He replied, "If I tell you, you will not believe, and if I question you, you will not answer. But from now on, the Son of Man will be seated at the right hand of the power of God." All of them asked, "Are you then the Son of God?" He said to them, "You say that I am." Then they said, "What further testimony do we need? We have heard it ourselves from his own lips." Devontae Sanford was only 14 years old when his life changed forever. While standing in his pajamas in his front yard, police arrested him for a quadruple homicide. He was taken to the police station, interrogated for 24 hours, and denied the right to see his parents or have an attorney present. Under the strain of those circumstances, he confessed to the murders, was tried as an adult, and sentenced to 39 to 92 years in prison. The problem? Devontae did not commit the murders. Another man came forward and confessed, but the state would not relent. Thanks to the advocacy of the Center on Wrongful Convictions at Northwestern University, Devontae Sanford was exonerated in 2016 after serving 9 years. According to the National Registry of Exonerations, since 1989 in the United States, there have been 1,966 innocent people exonerated for crimes they never committed. For many of them, their only crime is their poverty or race. They are simply unable to afford exceptional legal representation. And because of the color of their skin, many juries, sadly, find it difficult to believe they did not commit the crime. So they are quick to condemn. As we arrive at this third station with Jesus, it is worth remembering that it was not evil people who condemned him. The people who passed false judgment were the good ones, quote unquote good ones, the religious leaders, the ones who knew the law. Yet, in one of the saddest mockeries of justice in history, they sentenced Jesus to death. But not before they asked him this question: "Are you the Son of God?" Then, even after Jesus answered in the affirmative, they condemned the Son of God to death. How many people could be saved from wrongful condemnations in our own courts of law if we simply acknowledge this truth? Like Jesus, we are all sons and daughters of God. At some point in our lives, most of us have heard this proverb: when you point a finger at someone, there are 3 more pointing back at you. Take a look at the picture you are coloring. Notice all the fingers. Who are they pointing at? Are they your fingers? Have you ever said something untrue or unkind about a person just because they weren't like you? What would you do if you heard someone saying something untrue or unkind about your friend? Going deeper, when have you been guilty of condemning someone based on false externals? Have you ever hid behind the veneer of your own religious beliefs in an attempt to justify your prejudice? Station 4, Denial. A reading from Matthew chapter 26, verses 69 to 75. Now Peter was sitting outside in the courtyard. A servant girl came to him and said, "You also were with Jesus the Galilean." But he denied it before all of them, saying, "I do not know what you are talking about." When he went out to the porch, another servant girl saw him, and she said to the bystanders, "This man was with Jesus of Nazareth." Again he denied it with an oath, "I do not know the man." After a little while, the bystanders came up and said to Peter, "Certainly you are also one of them, for your accent betrays you." Then Peter began to curse, and he swore an oath, "I do not know the man." At that moment, the cock crowed. Then Peter remembered what Jesus had said, "Before the cock crows, you will deny me 3 times." And he went out and wept bitterly. In the autumn of 1934, the Detroit Tigers were in the middle of their first pennant race in 25 years. Hank Greenberg was one of the team's first basemen and one of the greatest sluggers of all time, with a batting average of .339. The Tigers needed him in their game against the New York Yankees, but Greenberg, a Jewish American, was torn about whether he should play the game that day. It was September 1st, Yom Kippur. After consulting with his rabbi and family, Greenberg made the decision to not play. With American anti-Semitism on the rise, Greenberg's decision was not popular. Fans shouted, "Rosh Hashanah comes every year, but the Tigers haven't won the pennant since 1909. But Greenberg remained true to his convictions, attending synagogue services that day rather than denying his faith by playing a game of baseball on the Day of Atonement, the holiest day of the Jewish year. It is not always easy to be true to our religious convictions when forces from all sides are asking us to deny the very things that give us life. Peter found this out in the courtyard as he watched Jesus being led away to trial. Just weeks before, Peter had mustered up the courage to profess that Jesus was the Messiah, the Son of the living God. But now, when questioned, he denied he even knew his friend and Savior. Who knows what would have happened if Peter had the courage of his convictions at that moment? Would the questioning servant girl have come to believe in Jesus? Would Peter's testimony have been able to save Jesus from death? The Tigers lost to the Yankees that day. Who knows whether or not Hank Greenberg's decision to not play had anything to do with the results of the game. But what we do know is, in a small way, his decision to not deny his faith helped pave the way for a more tolerant baseball league and society. Take a look at the picture at this station. Is the person with folded arms a defiant Peter? Or could it be a defiant Jesus, saying to us, "No matter how many times you deny me, I will always love you"? Have you ever told someone you weren't a Christian because you were embarrassed? Do you think there is anything you could do that would make Jesus stop loving you? Going deeper, has there ever been a time that you have denied your faith or your belief in Jesus in order to fit in? Was it worth it? Have you ever experienced God's forgiveness after thinking you had done something that was unforgivable? Station 5, Judgment. A reading from Mark chapter 15, verses 1 to 5. As soon as it was morning, the chief priests held a consultation with the elders and scribes and the whole council. They bound Jesus, led him away, and handed him over to Pilate. Pilate asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" He answered him, "You say so." Then the chief priests accused him of many things. Pilate asked him again, "Have you no answer? See how many charges they bring against you." But Jesus made no further reply, so that Pilate was amazed. So Pilate, wishing to satisfy the crowd, released Barabbas for them, and after flogging Jesus, he handed him over to be crucified. Chances are you have probably never heard of Agnes Gonza Bojakshu. That's because we know her by another name, Mother Teresa. By the age of 18, she answered God's call to move to India and joined a religious order of nuns who had a commitment to helping the poorest of the poor in that country. Later, this saint of the gutter, as Teresa was sometimes known, founded her own religious order, the Missionaries of Charity, and dedicated the rest of her life to serving those whom society had judged as unworthy of love. Where others saw only the dregs of humanity, Mother Teresa saw children of God. Where others judged people based on their position in society, Mother Teresa judged them based on their position in the reign of God. In fact, she is quoted as saying, "If you judge people, you have no time to love them." At this fifth station, we find ourselves standing with Jesus in Pilate's judgment hall. He is tired and dirty from a sleepless night, humiliated by the spitting and hurting from the slaps of those who wish to mock him. His clothes are ragged and torn, and he is hungry. Then the chief priests accused him of many things. Most of us have probably encountered someone on a street corner or a bus stop or the train platform holding their hand out, asking for assistance of some kind. Many of the people we encounter in these situations look tired and dirty and hungry, and we begin to judge. And in our judgment of them, we found we had no time to love them. After the chief priests judged Jesus, Pilate handed him over to be crucified. Sadly, this is also what happens when we judge others rather than loving them. Our judgment condemns them to the death of hopelessness. Take a look at the picture at this station. Notice all the fingers pointing in judgment. What if, instead, they were all extended with a handshake of solidarity for the person judged wrongly? Fingers pointed in judgment will never find time to love. Have you ever thought less of someone because they didn't have nice clothes or a beautiful house? How do you think it would feel to be that person? Going deeper, how might you focus more on loving others rather than judging them? What concrete actions could you take to love someone whom others think is unlovable? Station 6, Crowning. A reading from John chapter 19, verses 1 to 3. Then Pilate took Jesus and had him flogged. The soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head. They clothed him in a purple robe and went up to him again and again, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews!" And they slapped him in the face. There is a contemporary icon, Madonna of the Holocaust, which shows Mary dressed in the clothes of an early 20th century Eastern European Jewish woman, holding Jesus on her lap. They are surrounded by barbed wire and the names of horrific places like Auschwitz, Birkenau, Dachau, and Bergen-Belsen. There is a large yellow Star of David sewn onto Mary's clothes and a dove in Jesus' hands. The imagery used in this icon is a stark reminder that Jesus and Mary were both Jews, and had they been living in Hitler's world, they would have been forced into a concentration camp because of their faith. At this sixth station, we see the agents of the state forcing Jesus to wear a crown of thorns and a purple robe to identify him as the King of the Jews. The phrase, "the Jews," is sprinkled liberally throughout John's account of the Passion, and unfortunately, Christians have often used this as an excuse for anti-Semitism and mistreatment of our Jewish brothers and sisters. Many biblical scholars believe that a more accurate translation of the Greek word Judaioi would be Judeans, referring to a region, rather than Jews, referring to an entire religion. When it comes to religion and how we treat one another, words do matter. Whether Jesus lived in 1st century Jerusalem or 20th century Germany, he will always be found with the marginalized, the oppressed, and the forgotten. Take a look at the picture at this station. Notice the triangle in the middle. It seems to have broken pieces of glass or rock strewn on it. As you ponder those shapes, be mindful of all the lives that have been broken over the centuries because of religious prejudice and the careless misuse of language. How do you think Jesus wants you to treat people of different religions? What could you do to learn something about the Jewish religion? Going deeper, is it strange to think of Jesus as a Jew rather than a Christian? What implications might that have for your own relationships with people of other faiths? Station 7, Bearing. As soon as the chief priests and the police saw him, they shouted, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" Pilate said to them, "Take him yourselves and crucify him. I find no case against him." They cried out, "Away with him! Away with him! Crucify him!" Pilate asked them, "Shall I crucify your king?" The chief priests answered, "We have no king but the emperor." Then he handed Jesus over to them to be crucified. So they took Jesus, and carrying the cross by himself, he went out to what is called the place of the skull, which in Hebrew is called Golgotha. The permanent collection of Pacific Lutheran University in Tacoma, Washington, houses a sculpture by Howard Dale titled "The Burden." Crafted in bronze, the cross already has a weightiness about it as Jesus drags it behind him. But it is what is on the cross that makes it seem even heavier. Sculpted into the cross is 2 centuries worth of humanity, beginning with Adam and Eve at the bottom and ending with modern-day firefighters at the top. In a very powerful way, it visually demonstrates the cosmic consequences of Jesus' decision to take up his cross and carry it all the way to Calvary. This 7th station seems to be a very lonely one. John puts it this way, "And carrying the cross by himself, Jesus went out." Christians have argued for centuries over whether or not Jesus had to die. We have debated about the meaning of his death, and we have disagreed about its consequences. But what we do agree on is that somehow his solitary decision to take up the cross changed the course of history and had eternal consequences for all of humanity. The Orthodox tradition has long held that Adam and Eve had been waiting for centuries in their graves for the coming of the one who would rescue them from sin and death. Perhaps as Jesus dragged his cross through the city streets that day, it began to rip apart the hardened earth where Adam and Eve lay waiting for resurrection. And perhaps Jesus' decision to carry his cross right into the face of death that day is what inspires people like the firefighter in Dale's sculpture to walk into burning buildings to save others. Take a look at this picture at this station. Jesus appears to be carrying his cross resolutely, with precision, to the place of salvation. There is no hesitation. He is not looking back, because he knows that his lonely decision will save humanity and inspire countless others to selfless acts of service. When have you been asked to do something for someone else that you thought was really difficult? What gave you the strength to do it? Going deeper, what do you think about Jesus' decision to carry the cross as having cosmic consequences? How does Jesus' decision to carry the cross inspire you to engage in acts of selfless love for others? Station 8, Helping. They compelled a passerby who was coming in from the country to carry Jesus' cross. It was Simon of Cyrene, the father of Alexander and Rufus. Parents are increasingly making volunteering a regular part of their routine, whether it's delivering meals to the homebound, planting vegetables in a community garden, or spending time with people at the local senior center. And when parents and children engage in these activities together, the results are overwhelming. One study looked at 47,000 children in 5th through 12th grades in public schools across the United States. The study results indicated that children who served just 1 hour or more a week were less likely to be involved in at-risk behaviors than those who are not active in volunteering. At this 8th station, we encounter Simon of Cyrene, the man whom the soldiers forced to help carry Jesus' heavy cross. Coming in from the country was Simon, the father of Alexander and Rufus. We don't know much about Alexander and Rufus. We don't know if they were children on the day of Jesus' journey to the cross. But imagine if they were. One tradition says they went on to become missionaries in the early Christian church. Some have even suggested that the Rufus mentioned by Paul in his letter to Rome is Rufus, the son of Simon the Cyrene. Whatever the case, what we do know is that Rufus and his brother Alexander saw their father give a helping hand that day to someone in need. And that someone in need just happened to be the Son of God. We should never underestimate the power of our own example in the lives of children. Whether we have children of our own, nephews and nieces, godchildren, or children of friends, they all look to us for examples of how to be kind and helpful to people most in need. Ralph Waldo Emerson once wrote that the purpose of life is not to be happy. It is to be useful, to be honorable, to be compassionate, to have it make some difference that you have lived and lived well. Alexander and Rufus learned these traits from Simon. Take a look at this picture at this station and notice all the lines that intersect. As you ponder them, imagine all the lives that have intersected with yours over the years because of your kindness. For the children, how have the adults in your life given you examples of how you should care for others? What is one way that you could help someone today? Going deeper, and for the older youth and adults, how have you set an example of kindness for the children in your life? For all of us, How would it change the way you helped people if every time you extended a helping hand to someone, you imagined that they were Jesus? Station 9, Blessing. A great number of the people followed him, and among them were women who were beating their breasts and wailing for him. But Jesus turned to them and said, "Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children. For the days are surely coming when they will say, 'Blessed are the barren, and the wombs that never bore, and the breasts that never nursed.' Then they will begin to say to the mountains, 'Fall on us,' and to the hills, 'Cover us.' For if they do this when the wood is green, what will happen when it is dry?" As Christians, we are keenly aware of the power of gesture in our communal life. The pouring of water, the breaking of bread, the washing of feet, all of these have deep meaning. But there is a gesture that may get overlooked from time to time. It is the gesture of raising one's hand in blessing. In more liturgical churches, the priest or minister blesses the congregation with the sign of the cross at the end of worship. Take a look at the picture at this station. The way Jesus' hand is raised in blessing looks much the way some ministers bless the congregation. It is the way Lutherans, Catholics, and Episcopalians bless themselves, 2 fingers up and 3 fingers down. Orthodox Christians place 3 fingers up and 2 down. Either way, there is profound symbolism in this gesture. The 3 fingers together represent the Trinity, while the other 2 symbolize the divine and human nature of Christ. An ancient saying says, "Lex orandi, lex credendi." As the church worships, so the church believes. Look around next time you are in worship. The gestures your congregation uses will give you a little insight into what your congregation believes. The fingers used in blessing remind us that God, in the person of Jesus, became a human so that we, through the death of Christ, might share in the divine life of God. At this 9th station, Jesus encounters the women of Jerusalem, and we hear strange words. "Blessed are the barren, and the wombs that never bore." Exactly the opposite of what we hear at the beginning of Luke's Gospel, when Gabriel announces to Mary that she will give birth to Jesus. "Blessed are you among women, and blessed is the fruit of your womb." Perhaps the words in Luke's account of the Passion are a reminder to us that every moment of our lives, even in those places that seem the most forsaken, and especially those places, can be places of God's blessing. And it is precisely those most human of conditions that Jesus wishes to bless, to transform, and to take up into the divine life. Take another look at the picture at this station. It looks as if Jesus' hand is covered in bandages. We are most effective as agents of blessing to others when we have been wounded ourselves. Our own hurt makes us more empathetic to the pain of others. Hold your own hand up, positioning like the hand in the picture. Who needs your blessing today? What do you think it means when someone says, "God bless you"? Can you think of some times in church when the minister gives a blessing? How does that make you feel? Going deeper, How can the pain you have experienced in your own life be a source of blessing for others? How have you been affected by the use of gesture in worship? Station 10, Crucifixion. When they came to the place that is called the Skull, they crucified Jesus there with the criminals, one on his right and one on his left. Then Jesus said, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." And they cast lots to divide his clothing. The image of the cross has become so commonplace that we tend to forget how truly revolutionary it is. In 1949, the communist regime in Poland began to work on Nowa Huta, a new town just north of Krakow. In an effort to crush the Christian spirit of the Polish people and to reinforce the atheism of the Communist Party, the government decreed that there would be no church building in Nowa Huta. It was the first Polish city to be intentionally designed without a church. But the people's faith could not be so easily destroyed. They erected a large cross in the middle of the field where they wanted their church to be built. Each time they would put the cross up, the communists would bulldoze it down. In 1959, the young Archbishop of Krakow, Karol Wojtyła, celebrated Christmas Eve midnight Mass under the cross in the field. Hundreds of people came, standing in a freezing Polish winter night, to defy the government and worship the God who had come to set them free. After each Christmas Eve celebration, the government would again tear the cross down, and the people would again rebuild it. And Archbishop Wojtyła would return each Christmas Eve to celebrate midnight Mass. Finally, in 1967, the communists issued a permit for a church to be built. 1 year before he was elected Bishop of Rome, taking the name John Paul II, Archbishop Wojtyła dedicated the new church of Nowa Huta. A central element in the design of the church is a massive steel sculpture of the crucified Christ made by the steel workers of the city. Take a look at the picture at this station. On each crossbeam of the cross, it appears that ladders are ascending and descending. What makes the crucifixion so revolutionary is the truth that God, in the person of Jesus, descended to humanity, took on all the sufferings of the world, and died for the salvation of all people, so that we might ascend to the heights for which we were created. The vertical beam, plunged into the dark earth, also reaches up to the highest heaven, spanning the gulf between God and humanity. And the horizontal beam reaches from the criminal on Jesus' right to the criminal on his left, spanning the distance between alienated brothers and sisters. Once Karol Wojtyła became John Paul, he took this message of the cross he had learned during that time in Nowa Huta to the entire world. For him, the way of the cross was the way to peace. The mercy extended by Christ at Calvary was the mercy we should extend to all people. And he knew that suffering and oppression would not last forever, because all has been redeemed through the life and death of Jesus Christ. Look at the cross in your church, or the crosses in your home. Some churches have a cross with Jesus on it, and some churches have an empty cross. Which one do you prefer to look at? What do you think about when you see Jesus on the cross? What do you think about when you see an empty cross? Going deeper, could you imagine a time when you might use the image of the cross as a sign of protest against oppression? The Christmas carol, "What Child Is This?" contains these lines. Nail's spear shall pierce him through, the cross be borne for me, for you. Is it odd for you to think of the cross and the manger together? Station 11, Promise. One of the criminals who were hanged there kept deriding him and saying, "Are you not the Messiah? Save yourself and us." But the other rebuked him, saying, "Do you not fear God, since you are under the same sentence of condemnation? And we indeed have been condemned justly, for we are getting what we deserve for our deeds, but this man has done nothing wrong." Then he said, "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." And Jesus replied, "Truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise." The botanical gardens just north of Chicago are stunning places of natural beauty. In late fall, the gardens are filled with massive plantings of chrysanthemums in every imaginable hue. In winter, the beautiful twisted limbs and branches of barren trees are on full display against the dark sky. In the spring, tulips, daffodils, and crocus make their way up through the thawing ground. And at the end of summer, the air is perfumed with the scent of roses, making their last appearance before fall sets in again. In short, the gardens are a little slice of paradise. As he hung on the cross dying, Jesus promised the thief next to him, "Today you will be with me in paradise." This word that Jesus uses, a Persian word referring to a park or a garden, only appears 2 other times in the scriptures. Paul uses it in 2 Corinthians when speaking of a vision he had, and John uses it in the book of Revelation to describe the life that awaits those who have been faithful. To everyone who conquers, I will give permission to eat from the tree of life that is in the paradise of God. Jesus' words in Revelation are clearly an echo back to the tree of life in the Garden of Eden. The promise of Jesus is that, in the end, all things will be restored to their perfect state, paradise. Take a look at the picture at this station. A garden of flowers appears to be emerging from the base of the cross. Paradise seems to be starting to bloom. During the worship of Holy Week, many churches sing the ancient hymn, "Sing, my tongue, the glorious battle." The last stanza says this: "Faithful cross, true sign of triumph, be for all the noblest tree. None in foliage, none in blossom, none in fruit your equal be. Symbol of the world's redemption, for your burden makes us free." The message of this 11th station is that for those who place their trust in Jesus, paradise begins to blossom right here, right now. But just like the botanical gardens, there is a creative cycle in the paradise of life. Sometimes things are blooming all around us. Sometimes beauty is lying dormant for a while underneath a frozen earth. And sometimes things must wither and die in order to be renewed and reborn. This is all part of the life of paradise. But the promise of Jesus to the thief and to us is that today you can live with him there. What do you think heaven looks like? Have you ever wondered what happens to people when they die? Going deeper, Jesus promised the criminal that today he would be with him in paradise. What do you think about the idea that paradise begins here and now? How might it change the way you practice your Christian faith to believe that we do not have to wait until we die in order to live in paradise with Jesus? Station 12, Care. Meanwhile, standing near the cross of Jesus were his mother and his mother's sister, Mary the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. When Jesus saw his mother and the disciple whom he loved standing beside her, he said to his mother, "Woman, here is your son." Then he said to the disciple, "Here is your mother." And from that hour, the disciple took her into his home. Around 250 CE, a devastating plague swept from Ethiopia across North Africa, then to Italy and the Western Empire. At the height of the plague, which was most likely an outbreak of smallpox, 5,000 people a day were said to be dying in Rome. Many Roman citizens simply abandoned their family and neighbors, tossing them out into the street to die. The early Christians, however, went into the streets, caring for the dying and burying the dead. Almost 200 years later, around 416 CE, the Patriarch of Alexandria in Egypt organized groups of volunteers from the local church to transport and care for the sick. They were called parabolani, the reckless ones, because they ventured into places of sickness and death where others refused to go. Where did these early Christians get the inspiration to be so reckless in their caring, not only for fellow believers, but for all their fellow citizens? At this 12th station, we find the answer to that question. Jesus, now in the last moments of life, concerns himself not with his own suffering, but with the suffering of his mother and one of his best friends, who were gathered at the foot of the cross. Mary, his mother, was most likely a widow at this point in her life. Now, with the death of her eldest son, she would be relegated to the lowest rungs of society and no one to look after her. So Jesus motioned to John, the beloved disciple, and asked him to take Mary into his own care. "Behold your mother." And he asked Mary to look after John as if he were her own son. "Behold your son." There at the cross, Jesus asked his followers to be reckless in their care and concern for one another. He asked them to strip away the traditional ideas of what constituted a family and to forge a new family of faith that would care for one another at all costs. Tertullian, an early Christian leader, once said that when the Romans saw Christians in action, they would exclaim, "See how they love one another!" As Christianity spread, so did the early Christians' love. They went on to establish some of the first hospitals in the world, buried the dead with dignity, and treated all people with care and respect. Take a look at the picture at this station. The beloved disciple's arm is lovingly placed around Mary's shoulder. Take a moment and think about who is in need of your care in this moment. What are some ways you could show another person you care for them? Have you ever thought about the people in your church as your family? Going deeper, when have you been reckless in your care for another person? How might your relationships with people in your congregation or community change if you thought of them as family? Station 13, Darkness. It was now about noon, and darkness came over the whole land until 3 in the afternoon, while the sun's light failed. And the curtain of the temple was torn in two. Then Jesus, crying with a loud voice, said, "Father, into your hands I commend my spirit." Having said this, he breathed his last. On July 1st, 1941, the Nazis occupied Riga, Lithuania. 4 days later, every synagogue in Riga had been burned to the ground. Every synagogue except one. The Pietav synagogue was too close to the city center, and the Nazis feared that setting it on fire would put the other city buildings in danger. So they ransacked it and converted it into a warehouse for their evil and dark purposes. If you go into a Jewish synagogue, you will notice that the most central feature of the sanctuary is the Ark, the Aron Kodesh, where the Torah scrolls are housed. Many arks contain heavy curtains that are pushed aside during worship to reveal the scriptures they contain. Following the war, it was discovered that the eastern wall of the Pietav synagogue, where the wall where the ark was located, was a false one. Christians from the local Reformed church, led by their pastor, Gustavus Scharums, had hastily erected the wall to protect the sacred scrolls. Today, the synagogue is a flourishing center of Jewish life within the city. The curtains on the ark in many synagogues recall the ones that originally hung in the Holy of Holies in the Jerusalem temple, separating the people from the inner sanctum of the sanctuary. Only the high priest was allowed to enter, and only once a year. In the beginning of Luke's Gospel, Zechariah, the high priest, is performing his duties behind that curtain when the angel Gabriel appears to him, telling him that he will have a son, John the Baptist. After John's birth, Zechariah sings the Benedictus, a song known to many Christians. The last lines of that hymn say, "Though the heartfelt mercies of our gods, through the heartfelt mercies of our God, God's sunrise will break in upon us, shining on those in the darkness, those sitting in the shadow of death." At this station, we arrive at the end of Luke's Gospel. All hope that God's sunrise will appear seems to be lost. Darkness comes over the land, and the sun's light fails. But then, an amazing event happens in the midst of this darkness. The veil in the temple is torn in two. The false wall that had been erected between God and humanity comes crushing down at the death of Jesus. Just as the scrolls that were discovered behind the wall in the Pietav synagogue gave light to that community, so the tearing of the temple veil at the death of Jesus reveals to us the light that God has always intended for creation. Take a look at the picture at this station. Notice that you are looking from behind the veil to the cross. It's as if we were always on the inside, just waiting for God's sunrise to break upon us. As you ponder the images on the veil, be mindful of those who still sit in the shadow of death. How might you rip the veil open for them? Can you think of a time when you might have been afraid of the dark? What did you do to help you overcome your fear? Going deeper, where are some places in the world where you see people sitting in the shadow of death? How is God challenging you to bring God's sunshine to them? Station 14, Burial. When it was evening, there came a rich man from Arimathea named Joseph, who was also a disciple of Jesus. He went to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. Then Pilate ordered it be given to him. So Joseph took the body and wrapped it in a clean linen cloth and laid it in his own new tomb, which he had hewn in the rock. He then rolled a great stone to the door of the tomb and went away. There is a story told in South Africa about some children who threw rocks at a delivery van one day. The army was called and they opened fire, killing an innocent 10-year-old girl. One of the soldiers was chosen to guard the little girl's body, which was lying in the dust, while they waited for the authorities to arrive. Seeing that the girl's dress was torn and her body exposed, the soldier took off his own shirt to cover the child. Then he stood guard, dressed only in his pants. When one of the other soldiers mocked him and asked why he would do such a thing, the soldier replied, "She is also made in the image of God." Christians throughout the ages have always given great respect to the human body after death. Whether through washing and anointing, incensing, sprinkling baptismal water, burying it in the earth, or returning a person's ashes to God's creation, Christians have ritually shown their profound belief that our bodies are dwelling places of God's Spirit. Our funeral practices are meant to remind us of the truth found in the opening chapters of the Bible when God said, "Let us make humankind in our own image." At this 14th station, we meet Joseph of Arimathea, a person of great wealth and merciful compassion. Mary was the widow of a poor carpenter, and Jesus was an itinerant rabbi. In the eyes of many, they were probably just poor peasants. In the eyes of the state, Jesus was a criminal unworthy of a proper burial. But to Joseph, a secret follower of Jesus, Jesus was the very image of God, and as such, he deserved a respectful burial. Take a look at the picture at this station. On the front of the stone, there appears to be a seed hanging from the branch of a tree. Around the seed, it looks like things are beginning to emerge and grow. As followers of Jesus, the seed of resurrection life has already been planted in our hearts. And on the day of our own burial, that seed will begin to sprout as we make our way back home to the God in whose image we were created. Take a closer look at the picture. Perhaps what looks like a seed is also a cocoon. At first glance, a cocoon doesn't seem to be a likely image for Easter, but it's what's going on inside that counts. The old caterpillar is being transformed into a beautiful butterfly that will emerge, bright with color and full of new life. As you ponder this station, think about how your own life has been transformed by taking this journey with Jesus this Lenten season. From 2 Corinthians, Now we look inside, and what we see is that anyone united with the Messiah gets a fresh start, is created new. The old life is gone, a new life is bursting forth. Look at it. Have you ever been to a cemetery? How did it make you feel to be around the graves? Have you ever seen a butterfly come out of its cocoon? Why do you think the butterfly is one of the symbols people use at Easter? Going deeper, how does your own tradition give respect to the body after death? What do the funeral rituals of your church teach you about the dignity of the human body? Station 15, New Life and a New Beginning. When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James and Salome, brought spices so that they might go and anoint Jesus' body. And very early on the first day of the week, when the sun had risen, they went to the tomb. They had been saying to one another, "Who will roll away the stone for us from the entrance to the tomb?" When they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had already been rolled back. As they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. But he said to them, "Do not be alarmed. You are looking for Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has been raised. He is not here. Look, there is the place they laid him." Peter Marshall, the great Presbyterian preacher of the 20th century, once wrote, "The glorious fact that the empty tomb proclaims to us is that life for us does not stop when death comes. Death is not a wall, but a door." Francis, the great Roman Catholic Pope of the 21st century, preached that Jesus no longer belongs to the past, but lives in the present and is projected toward the future. Jesus is the everlasting today of God. On Easter Sunday, many Christians will sing the familiar words of Psalm 118. "This is the day the Lord has made. Let us rejoice and be glad in it." Or in our case, we sang that on Palm Sunday. The witness of Scripture and the witness of over 2,000 years of Christian faith is that on that very first day of the week, God did something extraordinary by raising Jesus to new life and giving all humanity a new beginning. Many people have a tradition throughout the year of visiting the graves of their loved ones. On Memorial Day, they may spend time at the cemetery cleaning the tombstone and planting flowers. At Christmas time, they may bring an evergreen wreath and holly. And on their loved one's birthday, they may place a memento on the edge of the tomb. All of this is admirable and may help us cope with our loss and grief. But the message of this last station is that life does not end at the tomb. In the words of one funeral prayer, "For your faithful people, life is changed, not ended. Death is but a door to the eternal life that awaits God's faithful people." But the resurrection of Jesus is also a reminder that eternal life begins right here, right now, today. For the women who came to the tomb early that Sunday morning, death was all they were expecting to see. Imagine their amazement when, in the place they expected to only encounter grief, was an angel of light telling them to turn back around, spread the good news, carry on the mission, and be on the lookout for Jesus in the places they least expected to see him. In the words of a contemporary Easter hymn, "Because you live, O Christ, the spirit bird of hope is freed for flying. Our cages of despair no longer keep us closed and life denying. The stone has rolled away and death cannot imprison. Oh, sing this Easter day, for Jesus Christ has risen." Take a look at the picture at this station. The image of Jesus seems to be transcending all time and space as he stretches his hands out over the horizon. Those who were dwelling in the land of the shadow of death have seen a great light. God has been with all those who are walking through the valley of the shadow of death. Indeed, there is no place on earth that has not been touched by the new life of resurrection. How do you think God brought Jesus back to life? If you were one of the women coming to Jesus' tomb, how would you feel when you saw the angel sitting there? And going deeper, most of us think of eternal life as something that begins when we die. How would your outlook on life change if you thought of eternal life as having already begun for you? Think of a time when you experienced new life or a new beginning in a place you were not expecting it.